The safety gauge reading was 15 psi over maximum operating pressure when I found Jason Whitfield in the corner office, feet up on his desk, playing some game on his phone. The boiler system that could kill half the night shift if it blew, and this kid was worried about his high score. My name is Gary Mitchell. I'm 47 years old. And that morning I realized everything I'd spent 25 years building at Whitfield Steel was about to get people killed. But let me back up to where this really started. 3 weeks earlier, I'd walked into the Monday morning safety briefing expecting the usual routine. Check the weekend incident reports, review the maintenance schedule, go over any OSHA updates with the crew. Standard stuff I'd been doing since 1999 when Charles Whitfield hired me as a safety technician fresh out of community college. Back then, I was still adjusting to civilian life after 2 years in Vietnam. The Army had taught me discipline, attention to detail, and the importance of following procedures that kept people alive. Charles seemed to respect that when he hired me. "We need someone who understands that cutting corners kills people," he'd said during my interview. Turns out that philosophy had an expiration date. Charles stood at the front of the conference room that Monday, looking pleased with himself in that way that usually meant trouble for the rest of us. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and machine oil. Same as always, but something felt different. The veteran crew members, guys like Steve Coleman who'd been running the blast furnace for 15 years, were exchanging glances that said they already knew what was coming. "I want to introduce our new plant safety director," Charles announced, gesturing toward a young guy in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never set foot on a factory floor. His shoes were too clean, his hands too soft. "My son Jason just finished his MBA at Penn State, and he's going to be implementing some exciting new efficiency protocols." Plant safety director. The position I'd been working toward for 8 years. The promotion Charles had been promising me every review cycle since 2016. "We need someone with fresh perspective," he'd always say during my annual reviews. Someone who can think outside the box. Apparently that someone was his 28-year-old son who couldn't tell a pressure valve from a coffee maker. I felt my jaw clench, the same way it used to in Vietnam when a lieutenant fresh from West Point would order us to take a position he'd never scouted. The difference was, back then, the only people who got killed were soldiers who'd signed up for the risk. Here it would be welders and crane operators with families to feed. Jason stood up, flashing the kind of confident smile that comes from never having doors slammed in your face. "I'm excited to work with you all," he said, his voice carrying that practiced corporate polish they teach in business school. "I know there's a lot to learn, but I think we can really streamline operations here and boost our quarterly numbers." Streamline operations, boost quarterly numbers. In a steel plant where one wrong move with molten metal could turn a man into vapor. Eddie Martinez, our union rep, was sitting 2 seats down from me, and I could see his knuckles go white as he gripped his coffee cup. After the meeting, the crew filed out with the kind of quiet tension that meant trouble was brewing. Steve Coleman caught my eye and shook his head slightly. These guys had seen enough management changes to know when their lives were about to get more dangerous. I caught up with Charles in the hallway outside his office. The walls were lined with photos from the plant's 40-year history, groundbreaking ceremonies, safety awards, pictures of Charles with various politicians and business leaders. Notably absent were any photos of Charles actually working on the floor. "What about the director position we discussed?" I asked, keeping my voice professional, even though my hands were trembling slightly. "Gary, you're a great safety manager," Charles said, not meeting my eyes. He was shuffling through a stack of papers, the same avoidance tactic he'd used when laying off 3 guys from the night shift last Christmas. "But we need leadership with broader vision. Jason brings strategic thinking to the role." Strategic thinking. The kid who'd asked me yesterday what the difference was between structural steel and rebar. The same kid who'd wondered aloud why we needed safety meetings every week when nothing ever happens anyway. "What's the salary range for the director position?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer would make me sick. Charles hesitated, his eyes flicking toward his office door like he was planning his escape route. "That's confidential, but it's competitive with industry standards." Industry standards, right? I'd worked in enough plants to know what safety directors made, especially ones with actual experience and certifications. But I also knew that nepotism had its own salary scale. "Charles," I said quietly, "I've been here 25 years. I've kept this place accident-free for the last 8 years since you promoted me to manager. I've got every safety certification OSHA requires and a few they recommend. What exactly does Jason bring that I don't? Charles straightened his tie, a nervous habit I'd noticed whenever he was about to say something he knew was wrong. Jason has an MBA, Gary. He understands business operations from a systems perspective. A systems perspective, I repeated. Does that system include understanding why we test the overhead crane cables every month? I'm sure he'll learn the technical aspects. That crane moves 40-ton steel beams over a crew of 12 men. Learning the technical aspects isn't a luxury. It's the difference between those guys going home to their families or going home in boxes. Charles's face hardened, and I recognized the expression from Vietnam. It was the look officers got when enlisted men questioned their orders, the look that said the conversation was over whether you liked it or not. "You're out of line, Gary," Charles said, his voice dropping to the tone he used when contract negotiations weren't going his way. "Jason is the director, and you report to him now. If you can't accept the chain of command, maybe you should consider other opportunities." Other opportunities. At 47, in a town where Whitfield Steel was one of the last major employers. Charles knew exactly what he was saying, and we both knew there weren't many other opportunities for a guy my age in this business. I stared at him for a long moment. Charles Whitfield, who'd shaken my hand when I came back from Vietnam and told me this company valued experience over politics, who'd promised me that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded, who was now threatening my job because I'd pointed out that his son was going to get people killed. "Understood," I said quietly. Then I walked out of his office and started planning my next move. The thing about Vietnam was, it taught you that when you're facing a superior force, you don't attack head-on. You gather intelligence, you find allies, and you strike where they're vulnerable. Charles had just made his first tactical error. He'd underestimated his enemy. That afternoon, I started documenting everything. Jason's first week on the job had been a clinic in dangerous incompetence, and I'd been too focused on training him to realize I should have been building a case file instead. There was the incident on Tuesday when Jason had approved overtime schedules that violated federal rest requirements. The regulation is clear: workers can't operate heavy machinery for more than 12 hours without an 8-hour break. Jason had scheduled the crane crew for 14-hour shifts 3 days straight because we were behind on the Morrison Industries contract. "It's just 2 extra hours," he'd said when I pointed out the violation. "These guys are tough. They can handle it. Fatigue kills in steel plants." I'd seen it happen. A crane operator working his second double shift misjudges a load by 6 inches, and suddenly you've got 20 tons of steel beams crushing everything underneath. But Jason was looking at spreadsheets, not thinking about the physics of exhausted men operating machinery that could level a city block. Then there was Wednesday's decision to postpone safety training to meet production targets. OSHA requires monthly safety briefings for all crew members. But Jason had decided we could skip February's session to focus on the backlog. "We can do a double session next month," he'd explained during our morning briefing. "Right now, we need every available man on production." I tried to explain that safety training wasn't something you could just double up on later, like makeup homework. It was about keeping safety protocols fresh in everyone's mind, making sure new procedures were understood, reviewing incident reports from other plants. But Jason had already moved on to discussing efficiency metrics and quarterly projections. The breaking point came Thursday afternoon when I found Jason in the equipment maintenance bay, arguing with our head mechanic, Tommy Rodriguez. Tommy had been maintaining industrial equipment longer than Jason had been alive, and he was trying to explain why we couldn't postpone the scheduled maintenance on the overhead crane. "The cables are showing stress fractures," Tommy was saying, pointing to the crane's cable housing with a flashlight. "See these little breaks in the wire strands? That's metal fatigue. We're maybe 2 weeks away from a catastrophic failure." Jason was checking something on his tablet, barely paying attention. "What's the minimum safe operating load for those cables? Rated for 45 tons, but with this kind of wear, I wouldn't trust them with more than 30. And what's our typical load weight? Depends on the beam size, but usually 35 to 40 tons. Jason looked up from his tablet with the kind of smile that meant he'd found a loophole. "So we're within safety margins. Let's postpone the maintenance until next month. The replacement cables are expensive, and we're already over budget on equipment costs." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Jason, Tommy just told you the cables are showing stress fractures. That's not a budget issue, that's a safety issue. The numbers say we're fine," Jason replied, tapping his tablet screen. 30-ton safety margin is more than adequate. "The numbers are wrong," Tommy said flatly. "Those cables are going to fail. When they do, whatever's hanging from that crane is going to drop like a rock onto whoever's standing underneath. I understand your concerns. Jason said in that patronizing tone he'd perfected in business school, but we have to balance safety with fiscal responsibility. The data shows we can safely operate for another month. The data. This kid was willing to bet men's lives on spreadsheet calculations rather than listen to a mechanic who'd been maintaining cranes since before Jason learned to tie his shoes. That night, I went home to my empty apartment and started making phone calls. The first call was to Tony Garcia's widow, Maria. Tony had been my best friend since we served together in Vietnam. He died in an industrial accident 15 years ago at a plant in Ohio where management had cut safety corners to save money. Gary, Maria said when she heard my voice, "How are you holding up?" I explained about Jason, about the safety protocols being ignored, about the crane cables that were going to kill someone if they weren't replaced. Maria listened without interrupting, the way she always did when something serious was happening. "This sounds like what happened to Tony," she said quietly. "Management putting profits ahead of safety until someone gets killed. I need the name of that OSHA investigator who handled Tony's case, the one who said the company should have faced criminal charges. Robert Chen. He's retired now, but he still consults on workplace safety cases. I'll get you his number." "Maria," I said, "if something happens at this plant, if someone gets hurt because I didn't do enough to stop it, you're not responsible for other people's bad decisions, Gary, but you are responsible for what you do about it." The second call was to Eddie Martinez at Local 847. Eddie had been shop steward for 12 years, had seen enough corporate stupidity to write a book. We agreed to meet that evening at the VFW bar on Route 30, the same place where Tony and I used to shoot pool after our shifts. The VFW bar was exactly the kind of place where working men went to forget about management for a few hours. Dark wood paneling, photographs of local veterans on the walls, the smell of cigarettes and beer that had soaked into everything over the decades. Eddie was already there when I arrived, nursing a Budweiser and reading the sports section. "You're telling me Charles hired his kid as safety director with no experience?" Eddie asked over his beer. His voice had that edge it got whenever we discussed management decisions that put workers at risk. Zero experience. "And he's making decisions that could kill our guys." Eddie shook his head, taking a long pull from his Budweiser. "My grandfather worked steel in Pittsburgh back in the day. He used to say the owners only care about safety when the lawsuits cost more than the coffins. We need to document everything," I said, leaning forward across the scarred wooden table. "Every time Jason ignores protocol, every maintenance delay, every shortcut. Build a case that even Charles can't ignore. What about going to OSHA directly? Already working on that, but we need internal documentation first, something that shows a pattern." Eddie was quiet for a moment, watching the condensation drip down his beer bottle. Around us, other veteran factory workers were shooting pool, playing cards, trying to forget about their day jobs for a few hours. These were guys who understood that management mistakes got measured in body counts, not quarterly reports. "Gary," Eddie said finally, "you know what happened to the last guy who went after management? Jimmy Kowalski over at the foundry? He filed complaints about safety violations, and suddenly he couldn't pass his annual physical. 32 years on the job, and they found a way to force him out. This is different. Jason's not just cutting corners, he's creating conditions that will definitely get someone killed. The crane cables alone. I know, but Charles has connections. City council, state representatives, half the county commissioners owe him favors. You sure you want to go to war with that?" I thought about Tony Garcia, about the promise I'd made at his funeral to his kids that their father's death wouldn't be forgotten. About the 12 men who worked under that crane every day, trusting that someone was making sure the equipment wouldn't fail. "I'm sure." Eddie nodded slowly. "Then we do this right. Full documentation, multiple witnesses, everything by the book. And Gary, when this gets ugly, and it will get ugly, you call me. Don't try to handle Charles and his lawyers by yourself." The third call was to Lisa Parker at the Lancaster Tribune. Lisa had been covering industrial news for 20 years, had won awards for her investigation into mine safety violations. I'd met her at a safety conference in 2019 when she'd interviewed me about our accident-free record. "Gary Mitchell," she said when I identified myself. "The steel plant safety manager. What's going on? Potential story for you. Family-owned company putting profits over worker safety. CEO's son making critical decisions he's not qualified for. Can you prove it? Working on it. But Lisa, if something happens at our plant, and I'm afraid something will, you'll want the background. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her typing in the background. Off the record for now, what kind of decisions are we talking about? I told her about the crane cables, about the overtime violations, about Jason's decision to skip safety training. Lisa asked pointed questions that told me she understood the implications. How many workers are we talking about? 150 total. 12 men work directly under that crane, and you believe the equipment will fail? Our head mechanic says we're maybe 2 weeks away from catastrophic failure. Jason wants to postpone maintenance another month to save money. Jesus. And Charles Whitfield is backing his son's decisions. Charles hired him. Everything Jason does has his implicit approval. More typing. Gary, I want you to document everything. Dates, times, specific violations. If you're right about this, people need to know before someone gets killed. Over the next 2 weeks, I became an intelligence gathering operation. Every morning, I'd arrive at the plant 30 minutes early to walk the floor and check equipment. Every evening, I'd update my files with the day's safety violations and management decisions. The pattern was worse than I'd initially thought. Jason wasn't just making isolated bad decisions, he was systematically dismantling every safety protocol I'd spent years building. He'd reduced the frequency of safety inspections from weekly to monthly. He'd eliminated the requirement for safety briefings before high-risk operations. He'd authorized the use of expired safety equipment because ordering replacements would exceed his quarterly budget targets. Most dangerously, he'd implemented what he called efficiency protocols that were actually just ways to cut safety margins. Workers were now required to handle larger loads in shorter time frames. Rest periods between shifts were reduced. The mandatory safety check procedures I'd instituted were shortened from 15 minutes to 5 minutes because experienced workers don't need to waste time on routine checks. I started carrying a digital camera to document equipment conditions. Photos of the crane cables showed stress fractures that were clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The hydraulic system on the blast furnace was leaking fluid that created slip hazards throughout the work area. Safety railings that should have been replaced months ago were held together with duct tape and wire. Each photo went into a folder on my home computer, cross-referenced with OSHA regulations and safety standards. I was building a case the way the Army taught me in Vietnam: methodical, thorough, bulletproof. But the more evidence I gathered, the more convinced I became that someone was going to die before I could get this information to the right people. Jason's changes weren't just increasing risk. They were creating conditions that made accidents inevitable. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when I was doing my routine pressure check on the boiler system. The gauge reading was 15 psi over maximum safe operating pressure. According to OSHA standards, that boiler should have been shut down immediately for inspection and repairs. I ran to Jason's office to report the dangerous pressure levels. The door was open, and there he was, feet up on his desk, playing some game on his phone, while a potential bomb ticked away 200 yards from his corner office. "Jason, we need to shut down the boiler immediately," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the adrenaline surge. "Pressure's way over safe limits." He looked up from his phone with mild irritation, like I'd interrupted something important. "How much over?" 15 psi. "That's enough to can it run until the end of the shift. We're behind on the Morrison Industries order, and Charles is breathing down my neck about production numbers." I stared at him, feeling something cold and dangerous settle in my chest. "You want to risk an explosion that could kill 20 men to avoid falling behind on a delivery? It's probably fine for a few more hours, right?" These things are built with safety margins. That's when I knew Charles Whitfield's son was going to get people killed, and I was the only one who could stop it. "No," I said. "We're shutting it down now. You can't make that decision without my approval. Watch me." I walked out of his office, straight to the boiler room, and hit the emergency shutdown. The system powered down with a deep mechanical groan that echoed through the plant like a dying animal. Production stopped. Alarms sounded. Workers gathered around, asking what was happening. Jason appeared 10 minutes later, face red with anger and embarrassment. Half the day shift was watching as he stormed across the factory floor in his clean suit and polished shoes. "You can't shut down production without authorization," he shouted over the noise of confused workers and idle machinery. "I just did, and I'm calling OSHA. You're fired." "Good. That makes this easier." I walked to my locker, cleaned out 25 years of accumulated gear, and drove straight to the Tribune offices. Lisa Parker was at her desk when I arrived, and she looked up when I knocked on her door. Gary Mitchell. You said if something happened, I'd want the background. What happened? The CEO's son just ordered me to keep a boiler running at dangerous pressure levels rather than shut down production. I refused, shut it down anyway, and got fired for it. Lisa leaned forward, her reporter instincts fully engaged. Can you prove any of this? I opened my laptop and showed her the documentation. 2 weeks of safety violations, ignored protocols, dangerous decisions made by someone who didn't understand the consequences. Photos of equipment, copies of memos, pressure readings, maintenance schedules that had been postponed for budget reasons. This is comprehensive, Lisa said, scrolling through the files. When can you go on record? Right now. But I want you to understand something. This isn't about me losing my job. This is about preventing people from dying because management values quarterly reports over human lives. The story ran the following Tuesday. Steel plant safety in question after veteran manager firing. Lisa had done her homework, confirmed details with other workers through Eddie Martinez, gotten quotes from industrial safety experts who reviewed Jason's decisions. The article painted a clear picture. Inexperienced management making dangerous choices while qualified employees were silenced or fired for speaking up. That same day, OSHA announced a surprise inspection of Whitfield Steel. Robert Chen, the investigator Maria Garcia had recommended, had reviewed my documentation and made some calls to his former colleagues. The inspection team arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, before Charles could clean up any obvious violations. What they found was worse than even I had documented. The boiler I'd shut down had a stress fracture in the main pressure vessel that could have caused a catastrophic explosion within hours. The overhead crane had cable wear that violated 3 separate federal standards. Tommy Rodriguez had been right about the 2-week timeline. The ventilation system was operating at 40% capacity, meaning workers were exposed to dangerous levels of metal dust and chemical fumes. But the most damning discovery was in Jason's office computer. OSHA found emails where Jason had explicitly ordered maintenance delays to meet budget targets, ignored safety reports, and dismissed worker concerns about dangerous conditions. One email to Charles read, "Dad, Gary keeps complaining about equipment problems, but the numbers show we can safely defer maintenance another quarter. These old school guys worry too much. OSHA's preliminary findings resulted in immediate shutdown orders for critical equipment and $485,000 in fines." Charles Whitfield faced potential criminal charges for willful endangerment. The Pennsylvania Department of Labor launched their own investigation into workplace safety violations. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Eddie Martinez. "Gary, you need to get down to the plant. Charles wants to meet." I drove to Whitfield Steel for the first time since my firing. Charles was waiting in his office, looking like he'd aged 10 years in a month. The confident, dismissive executive was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the consequences of putting family loyalty over worker safety. "Gary," he said quietly, "I made a mistake." "Which mistake?" "Hiring your unqualified son or threatening to fire me for doing my job." "Both." He paused, looking out the window at the plant where we'd both spent decades of our lives. "Jason resigned yesterday. The board demanded it after the OSHA report. He's working for his uncle's construction company now, learning the business from the ground up. Good for him. Better late than never. I'm offering you the plant safety director position. $95,000 salary, full authority over all safety protocols, and a written guarantee that no production decision can override safety requirements." I thought about Tony Garcia, about the 150 men who worked at Whitfield Steel, about the families who depended on this place operating safely. The salary was 32% more than I'd been making, exactly what Jason had been paid for, nearly getting people killed. "I want the position restructured," I said. "Safety director reports directly to the board, not to plant management. And I want mandatory safety training for any family member hired into management positions." Charles nodded slowly. "Done. And I want a memorial plaque for Tony Garcia in the main lobby, in memory of workers who died when safety was sacrificed for profit." That too. I started back at Whitfield Steel the following Monday. My first act as safety director was implementing a comprehensive equipment review with an outside engineering firm. The crane cables were replaced immediately. The boiler was repaired and recertified. New safety protocols were established that couldn't be overridden for production or budget reasons. 6 months later, OSHA presented Whitfield Steel with a Safety Excellence Award. During the ceremony, I thought about Tony Garcia and wondered if he'd approve of what I'd done. The answer came when Maria Garcia approached me afterward. "Tony would be proud," she said. "You did what he always said someone should do, put workers ahead of profits. Sometimes you have to choose between keeping quiet and doing what's right. The Army taught me that in Vietnam, and the steel industry taught me the consequences when good people stay silent. I chose to speak up. And for the first time in 25 years, I knew everyone was going home safe. Sometimes the people who built the system are the only ones with enough knowledge to tear it down when it becomes dangerous. And the courage to do it comes from remembering who you're really protecting. In the end, speaking up isn't about being a hero. It's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror and know that when lives were on the line, you chose what was right over what was easy.